And all right, Glenn, come up on stage. Great to see you, Glenn. Now, it's a real privilege for me to have Brigadier General Glenn Ryan up on stage from our Australian Army. And to give a little bit of background, but then just on notice, I'm going to ask you to tell a little bit just about how you got into the Army, how you got into the Australian military, and a tiny little synopsis of your career, because I know officers in the Australian Army tend to have actually very broad careers. They take quite a few different posts. But I actually first met Glenn when Glenn was in a posting with the business, which the Australian military do to broaden their minds. And Glenn and I got to know each other over coffee, talking about actually nothing to do with business and actually nothing to do with the Army, but actually really about philosophy, about ethics. And ethics as defined as the way the ancient Greeks thought about ethics, which is the way to live, the way to have a good life. And since then, Glenn and I have worked together in the Australian military context, and I can unreservedly say he's a very, very thoughtful human being. And that actually happens a lot. A lot of senior military officers are deep thinkers. And really, if you happen to live in a democracy, that's a really comforting thing. So with that introduction, Glenn, which I hope isn't too embarrassing, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Roger. And look, it's a privilege to be here and to actually talk about what Army actually does versus what you see on movies and the like, because it is very, very different. So look, I'm actually a Melbourne boy, chatty boy from Salesian College. So I actually live in Sydney at the moment, but I'm a local boy. And for some unknown reason, I always wanted to go to Army. I still to this day don't know why, but I know sitting here, I made the right choice back when I was not even 10 to want to go down that pathway. And so was very lucky. The Defence Force really does invest in education because of that exact reason. The ability to think, the ability to understand, the ability to question and think through things is fundamental. And so I went to the Australian Defence Force Academy. And UNSW, which was our partner then, really did focus on things. Now, it wasn't philosophy, I was very science and maths person. But as I went through my numerous postings, having served in East Timor in the early days, then in Syria, Israel, and the occupied territories, then Afghanistan a couple of times, you realise that there's a much bigger world out there. And the more you think, the more you learn, the better you can do what you need to do in those countries. And so I've invested a lot more time in reading different, and to be honest, 2 years ago, Roger and I were talking about aspects of Stoicism as it relates to protective factors for society. And so again, that led me on a different pathway of reading. And so I have had combat roles, but actually I spend more of my time now in strategic thinking and setting frameworks for a better future for our Army to support the things that we do today. So very broad, I can get into the specificity, but I think that sort of gives you the thematics of who I am and what I stand for.
Thank you, Glenn. So we've talked about character here. And in fact, I postulated that encouraging even kids to develop character was not a bad target to give them. So how would you define character?
It's really interesting listening to Rob talk about that this morning, because what he said really resonated with me, because about a month ago, Roger and I discussed about me coming down here. And I actually thought the definition or the way I define it has changed over time. So when I was young, I thought character was just something you had. You know, I was out in the sporting field, the way I behaved was just what I was. Then when I was young in those idealistic years as a young officer in Army, you know, courage, respect, initiative, teamwork, those are our values. And it's as I've grown up and thought more and read more and the education I've been given through Army, it's actually, character is about the values, the behaviours that you represent that people see, taking a step back to the things that you hold true, and then how you reflect on that to change to where you want to go. And so, very long-winded answer, but I think actually character now is those things that you hold core that then are reflected in your behaviours that people see, but they're not actually, you're not doing them for them to see it. You're doing it because that's what you want to be.
Great definition, Glenn. And I also know it's clearly a bit of an emergent process, isn't it? Probably for all of us. Now, you've heard something of the Stoic Virtues here. It's come up fantastically in a couple of the presentations. Are there any of the Stoic Virtues that particularly resonate for you?
It's interesting that you frame it that way. I don't know whether it's the realist in me or not, but all of them do at different times, depending on what's going on. And so I actually think through a number of different theories where overplaying one of those virtues is actually a weakness and those. But I do like your answer this morning about wisdom, because that gives you the ability to judge when to overplay and when not to overplay those, and the ability to sit back and think through those things. And then obviously thinking back at my own career, having the wisdom to decide when to press things and when not to press things in team environments brings out better outcomes.
Wisdom, that governing virtue, that certainly strikes me as so related to good judgment. So it's always struck me that consciously or subconsciously, the military and the Australian Army must have some way of collectively thinking about and developing character. So how does the Australian Army collectively, you think about character development? And does it, as a subsidiary question, does it still think it's important?
It is more important now than ever before. Historically, we have always thought through character development. You go back to some of our earliest pieces of doctrine, philosophy, back when the Australian Army became a part in 1901 of the Australian framework. And so it has always been a part of that, whether it's been in sport, adventure training, just the daily activities we do. But it's more important now than ever. If we think what is going on in the world right now and how complex it is, having the character of the individuals to operate within teams, to do the right thing at the right time, it is fundamental in the way that we have always operated, but it is more important now. As I read news this morning and so forth, the complexity of the environment that people are working in, we expect an individual to the best of their ability to make a good decision and the behaviours in that environment as they can. So, I mean, in the last 15 years, we've very much focused on our values. We've then focused that on a defence level, and then we've produced frameworks. I think now we're at a place where we're trying to operationalise them on a scale that probably we haven't done before, at a speed that we haven't done before, because of all of these factors.
So it's increasingly complicated in an increasingly complicated world. And of course, we have this conversation here with one sovereign state having invaded another, which I'm sure you've been watching closely this morning. So you've talked about the Australian military and the Australian Army, and particularly consciously thinking about values, consciously thinking about how to inculcate those values in the behaviour of the officer and enlisted men and women of the Australian Army. How does it actually go about the business of character development, other than thinking it through and talking about it?
So obviously I've sort of outlined that we've got philosophical documents and those things to help us. This is now about the operationalisation piece.
Which are called doctrine. That's what you refer to as doctrine.
I think if I reflect on a number of the questions that I've heard today and what was discussed over the last two sort of periods today, you've got to take theoretical into practice. And the question is, what you're actually asking is, how do you do that? So the Australian Army is from the Australian community. And so you end up with people from all over the country, and you actually end up with as well people who have just come to this country and got citizenship. So you've got this large group of people which all have come from different schooling backgrounds, and some schools, honestly, some schools do better than others in making young people think about their character. And so we've got to bring them all together, and then we've got to say, okay, well, how do we bring all of that diversity into the values that we as an organisation see as critical as you get down to the closer point of our output. And our output is, from an army perspective, is that soldier that is in aged care, that is doing flood support right now, that is able to operate in complex warfighting environments. And so we then take that output and we work backwards. And what we've learned is you've got to take a learning philosophy and you've got to do it in everyday activities. So yes, we sit them down and we go, hey, these are our values. What do you think about it? We then put them in small teams and we get them to talk about a scenario, sit down and talk through, okay, this terrible incident, how would you respond to it? Why? And take perspectives. Because I think until you take those perspectives, you're not probably looking at all the different ways that these things play out in a complex world. And so you then get to the next layer of that of how do you put that into a real team environment. And then you get into standard training practices where in scenarios things play out that weren't expected, and then you make it more and more complex. And now we're doing some of these in synthetic environments to do that. Without that framework to come back to the values and then go back out to the framework to application, I don't think any organisation can bring it to life. And I know that many actual even businesses out there are talking about values, producing compass methodologies and trying to operationalise it. But until people are doing it every day, the innate decision-making framework that is ethical, that produces the best possible outcome in the circumstances, complex circumstances, I don't think you'll achieve that. So effectively, we're doing it every day in everyday training activities at multiple levels, noting that it's not just about the soldier, there are people in different levels that have got to do things to get those outcomes. And in many cases, it's about how do you make it intuitive so that people are not necessarily stopping and thinking about it. The one last thing that I think is probably the most powerful in all of this is actual reflection. So the reason I say that is people will intuitively do things, but they won't have taken all of the variables into consideration. Until you are able to facilitate someone, we call them post-activity reports, until someone can reflect on what they did and why they did it, and then get the perspectives of the others in there, and then say, okay, how would I think through that differently? And then go back and redo the scenario. Because instantly you've gone from a box that's 5 by 5 to a box that's 10 by 10, and you slowly grow their intuitive decision-making where they can think about these things faster so that they can make better decisions.
Yeah, so this reflection is very important in all of that answer, isn't it? Be through practice, how can I do better? Through sitting down with the teams and consciously reflect. It's incredibly important in Stoicism, which is actually an underpinning of the journaling discipline, which is that discipline of reflection. So it's very useful to know. Now, perhaps one of the more personal and more difficult questions is, you will have led a lot of people in a lot of different contexts. It's inherent in actually being a military officer that you lead people in a lot of different contexts. How do you encourage them to think about their own personal development?
So I think that's another journey discussion. Back when I was a younger officer, and look, I was actually responsible for recruit training, so people who would come to the army. And I did that first values lessons with them because I felt it was a personal leadership responsibility aspect of things. And so there I'm talking about, what do the values mean to you? Reflect on those values and what does that mean on a daily basis? Then as I've grown up, it's more just sitting down with my team. So then there was sort of a window of time where it's, go away and get a good education. Go away and, go and study. And it doesn't matter what you study, it's study. Don't just focus on the professional aspects of things, but give yourself other ways of doing things. Where I'm at now with my team, I lead a very senior group of individuals as direct reports. Where I'm at now is, well, wait a sec, what are the outcomes we want with the behaviours to get it as a cultural change? So you don't get long-term systemic change unless you've got a systemic culture, multi-layered outcome. And so it's how do we think, how do you think, how do we think through doing those things? Because unless they are doing it on that level, it's just a drop in the ocean. And you've got to get that change, you've got to get everybody to be thinking about these things and doing those types of activities.
So it's multi-layered there, that question. And even in that answer, you've come back to values, as I know you do. And I think makes you a particularly effective officer, because you know the point you're starting from. And in fact, you know who you are and you know who you want to be.
Yeah, it's a really important point. If we can just talk about our leadership models, I think that comes to the actual point that's been raised several times today. Over the last, so we've always had a Serbian leadership model. All the way back to the Australian Regular Army came into being in the late 40s. But our first piece of doctrine after that was the leadership doctrine, and it was a very Serbian leadership model. Up, down, left, right, and the way. In a team, because the next step for anyone who's wearing a uniform is to then become a leader of teams. So that's just normal hierarchical model of army. So how do you lead teams? And again, it comes back to value-based decision making, understanding how and why you're making decisions so that you create the positive environment for the positive outcomes.
Starting with know thyself. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I'm going to see if there are any questions from the room at this point in time. Or are there any questions online? I know Dan, you've got that. And I'll just start with the room if that's okay, Dan. I've got a question here.
Like I found this very common within businesses and corporate world, where they'll have like a list of values. Like there was one where they had like the posters all up around the site. They were up there, they're like, these are our 5 pillars of values. It's so important. But then like they was just hot air. Like it wasn't engaged with it all, or like really some action thought through. Like how do you sort of avoid, because like it's not necessarily that I think they like management went out and they were like, oh, let's just pretend these are our values. It's like, oh no, they want to use those values, they just don't really act on them. How do you avoid it being hollow?
Might just repeat that back so everyone in the room heard the question. The question really is, you see so many values posted on walls that actually just aren't really discussed and lived values in the organization. They can become empty vessels. How would you respond to that, Glenn?
Yeah, look, as Roger said, I was lucky enough that Army to help me on my journey actually got me a placement in industry, and I watched that business actually go through that process. I'll talk my perspective, and then I'll talk to my Army perspective, and then I'll talk with the other companies that I have worked with and around through my roles. So from our perspective, we've got values, and we have those icons up to remind us on a daily basis what those values are. And I've already talked about the training piece, but then it's actually, you've got to live them by actually rewarding people that are doing the right thing against those values. And that can be everything from small certificates, calling them out in front of people and those things, but also rewarding the bystanders that call out the negative behaviours. The second piece to that then is actually many companies have annual reporting processes, and having values as a subset of that. That way what you're doing is you're rewarding the culture, you're actually building artifacts of the culture that gets through that. One of the large companies we're working with at the moment in a partnership, they've actually embedded all of that through to their KPIs. Now, you've also got to monitor this, because as we see with many cases, when you start rewarding behaviours and things, you can actually go, I mentioned before, strengths can become weaknesses in those cases. But I think until you are laying it through every part of your business, you're not living the values that you say you are, and so they're either just words to you or not. And that's where I think is coming, as I sort of said, the operationalising it from an Army perspective. We call it combat behaviours, combat communications, how you communicate with people to get the right outcomes, ethical decision making, those things. But until they are layered through the company, that you're actually reporting on someone annually and talking to them in their interim reporting and their annual reporting, then you're not really living the whole values. And the companies that I've seen that have been really successful have actually done that really, really well. But they've also monitored through different mechanisms to make sure that they're going too far, that their strength becomes a weakness.
That's a great question. Lyn Vu.
I guess with any setting desirable outcome for any training program or setting goals in general, there must be a consideration of what should the routine be for you to get to the goal that you want. So, for example, let's say for the fitness training program, one of the routine things you can do is 10 push-ups a day. So regardless of how much knowledge you have about health and nutrition and fitness, if you don't do the push-up, you don't get any fitter. So is there any opportunity to incorporate any Stoic exercise in the army training program as part of the routine?
So actually, I'll come back to the conversation I had with Roger about, it was about 2 years ago. So I think we already do it. I think it's already embedded in our doctrine. I didn't know it until about 2 years ago when Roger made some comments and I started looking to it. So we've already been looking at ourselves from a global view. We've already been looking at ourselves from a reflective point of view. Now, we may not have called it, the journaling as it's been framed by one of the Stoics, but we're already doing those things. And so, to some extent, we've just been following the bouncing ball through that process. But actually, it's a really interesting comment you made. I
was sitting down there earlier and I was listening to Will, Rob, and Roger up here. I was thinking about the human performance framework, which is cognitive, social, and physical. And this is another process when you go to schools of how do you get that balance to grow them in that character framework, because it's a balancing act between all of them. And so I completely agree that you've got to have those things in a training program when you know your outputs and how you reinforce them, because sometimes we overplay our strengths and focus too much on push-ups, or we focus too much on the nutrition. We don't get the balance, which I think is, as I have listened to today and in the research I did before coming here, I think is the fundamental is how do you get the right balance so that you're the person that you want to be into the future, that we are the army that the nation needs of us and for the community that we've got. So I think you're right, we've got to have it, we're going to have it in a balanced framework. If not, you end up with really strong arms, but your brain is not ready to do the next step of things.
All right, good answer, thank you. Okay, so the gentleman over here in the brown, and the lady here.
I imagine you've been in all kinds of complex situations. Could you describe a time when your conscience has been at odds with the organisation and how you've navigated that?
That'll be actually. Do you need to reflect on that one? And I'll move on to an easier one.
The conflict of interest. So I actually talk about one of my experiences on operations. And I'm not sure it necessarily hits it, but it comes to why the ability, as I listen to the Stoicism, to work through those things. So I was a peacekeeper. I've got to make sure I get the right term. Peacekeeper, yep. Observe and report. I don't have a weapon on me. I have body armour and a helmet. That's about it. And one of the countries had breached the peace agreement. And I'm coming round the corner in a car with a gentleman from another nation, 2 military members working together as a team. And I've come round the corner and I have seen the breach. And I'm looking out at this area and I'm seeing in front of me things starting to play out. And the rule is you go back to the observation post and you go down into your bunker and lock down. Why? Because the risk is losing the UN observers in that environment actually degrades the longer term risk. But there I was going, no, I've got to observe and report. And so in that circumstance, watching jets flying in and people firing at each other and those things, the decision that my mate, and it was a group decision, because it is better to make a group decision where you talk through the risks. We went and sat in a location where we could report all of it and then write out exactly what had happened correctly. Now, it is because you're worried after that, well, I'm going to get into trouble. You know, these people are going to come back to me and say, oh, actually, you're out of the country now because you didn't follow your rules. And that does happen, by the way. There is safety parameters in place for our own good. And unfortunately, 12 months later, 5 UN observers lost their life because they didn't go back and lock themselves down in this. But I come back to this very day and remember that the day after I wrote that report, what I was writing was being read out in the UN to highlight the violations from both parties in that. Do I say that I did the right thing in that situation? Yes. I also say to myself, I did the wrong thing, because if it hadn't have gone that way, I have family and all of those types of things. So it comes back to my earlier point is it's difficult to make the decisions and it's getting more complex. I made that decision, I got away with it, and I think it was the right outcome. But it's having the right framework to think through the decision at the time. And luckily, I had a very senior Irishman sitting next to me at the time to talk through on that discussion. So I hope that gives you how our frameworks work for that.
They're often not great rule followers, the Irish. Now, can I just add one thing to that? The Australian Army, and it's not well known, has a principle of leadership, which is mission leadership. And Glenn, you tell me if I get this wrong, but fundamentally, you're teaching people to make decisions so that the people who are closest to literally the action or the context can make a decision based on the principles and guidelines. And often that isn't a hard rule. There is no hard rule that you can reasonably apply. What you're doing is actually training people to make decisions. Now, that's a very simplified view, but that's mission leadership. And you want that in those morally complex contexts where you're going to have to potentially put your life at risk to be able to do a broader good and possibly breach a rule. Otherwise, if you just in complex situations for a very narrow rule sets, bad things happen. So I think one of the things that often comforts me is that Australia is very determined to have a mission-centric approach, teach people to make good decisions. Now, we've got a lot of, is that fair summary?
Yeah, it is. And look, lots of countries have that. I'm very aware that many countries actually come at how do we teach our people to apply it, because we seem to perform very well operationally, because it's not just about the term, it's how we live it.
Okay, there's a lot of questions. Lady here in the blue jacket.
We all realise the majority of people in the armed services are young. And
just like you, Glenn.
Yes, ma'am.
And you talked about character earlier, and that one of the aspects of character is wisdom. You know, I know when I was in my 20s, my wisdom was nothing like what it is today from lived experiences. And my mother always said when I was raising my son, you can't put an old head on young shoulders. I'm just wondering what the challenges are that you face with that in regards to the enlisted people.
Great question.
That's an awesome question. There's probably people out there that know this better than I do, but there's a bunch of genetic thinking about adolescent mindset. So your brain's not fully developed until you're about 27, and that's when the firing of the neurons change. And the behaviours in that window are about self-interest, not wanting to get into trouble. There is a behaviour about lying because of that, and those things. And what is the largest amount of the Australian Army? Young people under the age of 27, coming from diverse backgrounds. And again, I think it comes back to that really important factor around values, the framework and the training. So it means that we've got to train the younger part of the workforce slightly differently to the way we may have done it previously. And I'll talk about that in a minute. The second piece, I think, comes back to the really eloquent way Roger put mission frameworks in place. The mission philosophy, mission command philosophy that we've got, which is actually we've got leaders at right levels that can supervise them and guide them on their pathway. Now, I'm using that as very generic language, but to achieve the mission, you need leaders at the right level that can understand where their people are at, where we've got to get to, and the environment around them. When you then come back to people under the age of 27, and you're talking about learning versus training creates a learned outcome. It's how do you get the right balance of education and training? And what we've found is if you put people into scenarios and make them talk through those scenarios, they start to bind to their friends, and then you get values-based team behaviours. And then the important thing there, and someone who's probably a much smarter person I will go, but that's where you start getting groupthink towards negatives. That's where I come back to my answer I gave to you. That's where you've got the leadership in place to create the frameworks to bring them back onto target when they get out of whack. It's also important that in those situations, in those vignettes, you allow people to fail. And you go, okay, why did that happen? Because if not, you get to perfectionism. which we've already heard several times today, can actually be a negative outcome on the growth that is necessary. So everybody will be different, but what we've found thus far is when you do vignettes, you embed it in the behaviours, you end up getting those young people to make better decisions moving forwards. Interestingly enough, I made the comment about, to your question, that you give them rewards. In that adolescent mindset, when you start rewarding the positive behaviours, they actually start moving faster to where you want to go. And so that punitive model that you might see in movies that armies have had in the past is actually less effective. So again, when you come to values, behaviour and learning to get that outcome, when you use the positive behaviour models, you'll get them in that right pathway. They will still make mistakes. The question is, do they make mistakes outside our value framework? Because everything inside the value framework we can work through, outside the value framework, you can't.
Thank you, Glenn. Now we had a couple of other questions. Did we over on this side? A question over here. So just on that point about young people and mentoring young people, and I use that word mentoring, it sounds like mentoring. It's accelerated experience. So training exposes them to experiences that would take them a very long time to have outside of that accelerated context. And the way I think about Army is actually most of what you do is training. Actually, that's actually most of it. The Army is a training organization. You actually mostly don't want to use it, really. But it's deployable in lots of contexts like floods and pandemics. But it's mentoring, yes?
Yeah. Yes, there are many definitions to mentoring, facilitation and coaching. We use the term leading, but it is about that bringing the best out of the people to what we need to do. Just as I was reflecting while you were talking just then, the ability of young people to lead young people, it's not an easy thing to do, particularly when people come out of schools where it's about the individual and the individual's performance. And that's where things like sport in community is fundamental, because you end up with people connecting and to leading within their own groups. And so you end up with their own community outcomes in that framework, because people stop thinking about themselves, they're thinking about what's going on around them, which is fundamental, I think, when I've been listening to this morning and what we do. If you're not aware of what's going on around you, you're inwardly focused and you're probably not getting the best out of yourself. And then when I look at it from an Army perspective, you must always be externally looking, because it's not about you, it's about what is going on around you. I think back last year to a number of the stories that our teams have when they went out to support with COVID. And it's that respect and that initiative to do things in support of other people that actually created the better outcome. And then when you listen to the stories when they come back and you go, yeah, you're actually reflecting to improve yourself and your team to get that next level of things that are necessary.
And of course, that's been bushfires, COVID, aged care facilities. So we demand a lot.
And now floods.
And now floods, absolutely. Okay, any other questions? More over there.
Yeah, just going on from like your answer to one of the other questions where you're saying that for the young fellas, like when we put those right incentives in place, that they'll sort of rush towards that. Does that also create like a concern of getting those values correct, like in the way they're being implemented and rewarded? Because if they're going to be pursuing those very quickly, you could suddenly end up with like an outcome that you didn't sort of want, or like a development you didn't want.
Yeah, Roger will probably correct me on a couple of things I say here. Absolutely. If you look at all great organisations where they've fallen down, it's because they've overplayed their strengths. They've started to reward the wrong things and they've gone down the wrong pathway. Many armies have done some great things over their times, but then they've played too far to that left side of things. And I think Roger's point before, we've got some really great thinking people in our army that make sure through all of our leadership levels, we are looking out for that negative behaviour that comes through. So we've got our values very, very robustly in place. Effectively, go back to the early centuries, our values haven't changed that much, just some of the wording in the definitions. So from an army's perspective, from a defence's perspective, our values are really, really clear. What we've probably done more accurately today is through good soldiering, which is our framework for the accelerating environment that we're all in right now, is we've better framed what are the outcomes that we seek of our people with those values, and then through combat behaviours, we've done our next component of that. So we've done that very, very deliberately, and every business does that differently as well, but you've got to be monitoring from that. I was also, just once again, while Roger was talking then, there's a lot of great research out there about how armies train themselves. There was a guy called Grossman who wrote on killing, because what armies fundamentally do, the human body, the human brain is not wired to do. And so as things accelerate, if you think about what's going on in the Ukraine right now, there are people there that will do the wrong thing. There are people there that are trying to work through how to do those things. And the ones that will succeed for themselves, you know, to put mass aside in this case, people who will succeed for themselves, who have made good ethical decisions and done their best in that environment. And that's what you optimally want, because then you grow from that person to a team and to an environment. But the premise of your point, you've got to monitor the environment to make sure you don't go too far, is critical.
Okay, I think we're nearly done. There might be time for one more question. We've got the one at the back there.
I think you touched on it just then briefly.
Keep going, okay, yeah. We'll have to repeat.
I think I read a story, I don't know if it's true or not, around a bunch of Russian soldiers surrendering because what they were doing in the Ukraine was against their values. And it's an interesting situation. You talked about a less Serbian nature in the Australian Army. How do you match that individual leadership of everybody in the Army with a requirement in the Australian Army to do what they're told at times? And that potential tension between those two.
Do you want to repeat the question?
Yeah, I've got to repeat the question, thanks. So the question really is, we've talked actually about individual leadership, good judgment, which of course relates to the Stoic judgment, mission command, which is that idea that you're in a position because you're in the front line, you see the facts to make good decisions. How does that judgment, and we'll see some of it acting out now, play out with the demand to obey orders? And the example being given at the moment is that there are Russian soldiers who, as far as we know, have decided that their principles are best served by not obeying orders and surrendering.
So I accept the premise of the example you gave about the Russian soldiers. When I think about the Australian Army, the differences are so different. We're in a democratic environment, a democratic country that has a Westphalian model of tasking its forces to go and do things, which is based on legitimacy and law. So when you go right from the highest level of this, of the framework by which our values operate, it's in a legitimacy and law framework. And I made a comment before about bystander behaviour and rewarding those that call out inappropriate behaviour, because we have an ethical process in place. So we have a values-based ethical process to make sure that those things don't happen from the highest all the way down to the lowest level. And most importantly, if you read Soldier and Statesman, which is about the professional armies, about professional standing armies, volunteer armies, that has been their strength, that they have stood up and done those things. And in our history, we have had soldiers back in the First World War to stand up and do that. No, you know what? We're not doing this today because of this, this and this. So I think the Australian population should take heart that as a standing professional army, and in the entire model of our national framework, we have that in place, that we only have legitimate processes and legitimate methodologies by which we employ our values.
And I think many of those Russian soldiers are not standing army soldiers, they're conscripts, aren't they? A lot of them.
So the Ukrainian army is a professional standing army. They have now been reinforced by volunteers. It was conscript, but it was volunteers coming forward to go and do that. and the Russians have a standing but conscript-based army, which those things play out in more often than not. Argentinians in the Falklands is another example of a conscript army versus a professional army that applies legitimate law to the process of applying lethal force. I'm happy to talk about that offline if you want.
It's a ripper and a point, and I think finishing on the Ukraine and the differences between the armies is a great point at which to finish. I think we've run out of time now, Matt. If that's right, we do like to stick to time and give everyone the opportunity to grab a bite because it's lunchtime. Matt, is there anything you'd like to say before I thank Glenn? No, all good. Glenn? 45 minutes. Brilliant. And Glenn, that was just fabulous. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for giving us, all of us, those insights into the Australian Army and the way it thinks. Please do join me in thanking Glenn.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes, you can. Right, well.
Okay, good.
Thanks, Bob. Just 30 seconds.
That's right.
All right, welcome back everyone. I hope you had a good lunch. Thank you for coming back and making this next session possible. The speaker, our interlocutor for this session, needs little introduction. Bob Carr was, of course, the New South Wales Premier for many years. He's held diplomatic posts and continues to be a public commentator of note. So, first of all, Bob, on behalf of the organisers and everyone here, thank you so much for making your time available.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I look forward to it.
All right, well, let's get cracking then. First question, you probably get this a lot, but perhaps not in a Stoic form. The Stoics think a lot about public service, and they think a lot about development of character. We've been talking about that this morning. So can you tell us a little bit about, you know, when you decided to become a servant of the public and perhaps a leader, and also what character traits did you need to demonstrate to be as successful as you have been?
I think aspiring to a political career helps you bring out the best in your personality. Some people with a dim view of politics would find that surprising. But the notion that you build support in a community with the aspiration of having them vote for you and represent you in Parliament, I think encourages you to develop parts of your personality that are good. People, in the end, are going to support you if they like you. The one great bit of wisdom about a US presidential election is that if they like George W. Bush more than an Al Gore, you can tip him to win, even if it's narrow. And I think the political process works that way. And if we talk about one of our great Stoics, a popularizer of Greek Stoicism, Marcus Aurelius, he addresses precisely this. He writes, "Live each day as though one's last, never flustered, never apathetic, never attitudinizing. Here is the perfection of character." And if a politician aspires to that, he or she might well be unbeatable.
So Marcus has come out, it looks like, Bob, which is terrific, because my next question was going to be exactly about Marcus Aurelius. I remember reading some years ago that you had discovered Marcus Aurelius and that you were a fan, and it was indeed that thought and that recollection that brought you to mind when we were organising this event. So when did you discover Stoicism? When did you discover Marcus Aurelius? And I guess any particular ideas that Marcus has that might have spoken to you and attracted you to him at that time and since?
Well, I think one of the biggest ideas I found useful when I was Premier, and I think it was when I was Premier 1995 to 2005. I think it was sometime during that period, excuse me, this cough, that I was drawn to be short meditations. And when he advises his readers not to be flustered by, as he puts it, the enmities, the suspicions, the animosities, the conflicts, because these and these are aspects of political life are going to vanish with the dust and ashes, he inculcates a detachment that I think is very useful in politics. Don't overreact to a quote evildoer, unquote, because their behaviour is not intentional. They're behaving in a way because that's the way they're made by nature. Understand that. If I could sum up in a word of my own what Marcus Aurelius is telling a political leader, it could well be to underreact to provocation, to provocative circumstances, to underreact to provocative circumstances, or as he puts it, and I quote directly from the Meditations, quote, your part is to be serene, to be simple. Is someone doing wrong? The wrong lies with himself. Has something befallen you? Good. Then it was your portion of the universal lot assigned to you when time began. A strand woven into your particular web, like all else that happens. Life, in a word, is short, then snatch your profit from the passing hour by obedience to reason and just dealing. Unbend, but be temperate. And when I read that reference to just dealing, I was reminded of a quote from Abraham Lincoln. In a letter to a supporter, he said, and I quote, I shall do nothing in malice. What I deal with is too vast for malicious dealing. Just think of that. I shall do nothing in malice. What I deal with is too vast for malicious dealing. And that's a perfect embodiment of the spirit of this Stoic popularizer, the Roman Emperor, Marcus Aurelius.
So, Bob, we can already see from your responses that you have, choice selections of different books seemingly at your fingertips. And I know that one of the practices that you've undertaken, which the Stoics, of course, recommend, and Marcus was, of course, important with this, is writing down apothegms, writing down aphorisms, writing down things that you might hear that you find inspiring or guiding or instructional. And I understand from speaking to you that you've actually been keeping throughout your public career such a collection. Could you talk a little bit about that? And if you do have it at hand, maybe a couple more of those wonderful quotations as well would be terrific.
Sure. Well, I think that one of my books is this is an exercise book I started in May 2005, and I jotted interesting nuggets from the books I was reading at the time. It might only be half a page for a book, and it'd be a phrase or a sentence. For example, and this is just about random. I was reading Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, And I just thought there were things worth preserving. And it's less than a page, but it's such a vivid image when Virginia Woolf talks about one of the characters, an aristocrat, Lady Besborough, who was required to open a bazaar in the grounds of the country house, the mansion, the manor house, to open the bazaar. This is during the First World War, with a telegram of the son's death in her hand. I suppose you could say that's a version of Stoicism, but it was such, that was the reason I kept it. It was just such a vivid image of a certain type of character. The aristocratic mother has just received a telegram about her son's death, but nonetheless keeps her duty to open the bazaar. One could assume, in the grounds, one can assume the bazaar to raise funds for a war cause. And on the next page, I found that I dipped into the biography, my first biography of Virginia Woolf. I didn't read all of it, but I was interested in this. Leslie Stevens, the famous father, the biographer refers to his brutality, quote, the prototype for everything she hated about the terrible threat to one's liberty. And the biographer, Leon Lee, writes of Virginia Woolf's lifelong rage against her father. And if you think of the betrayal of the father into the lighthouse, the hatred that his children feel for him at moments of some unspoken climax in their relationship, you can see her, like so many writers, simply appropriating parts of the life. So they're the only things I've preserved, but I think that habit of keeping what I'm told is referred to as a commonplace book, with the essence of the most vivid image of a book that one's read, is very worthwhile. Reopening the book, and you do it pretty rarely, reopening the commonplace book and seeing what you've written down, is sometimes very surprising, and very often it's things that have been scoured from your memory.
So famous authors, famous writings, but also in a public life of famous figures. I wonder if you could perhaps share with us any stories that you might have, maybe just 1, 2, or 3 of the famous people that you meet, that you've met, and that you have particular impressions upon that might, I guess, particularly speak to the theme of today. Yeah, do you have such anecdotes as well as apothegms?
Yeah, I think when we were chatting, I mentioned what I always thought was an epiphany with Margaret Thatcher. It gave me a huge insight into her background and what her vintage meant. It was after she'd been forced out of the Prime Minister's job, and it was at a reception with Australian leaders in the Palace of Westminster to mark the centenary of the passage of the Australian Law through the UK Parliament. That was our constitution. Our constitution is a piece of legislation passed by Parliament in Queen Victoria's last years. So John Howard's officiated at this event, and all of a sudden I find myself in the crowd of space facing Margaret Thatcher. And I quickly said, Lady Thatcher, it's an honour to meet you again. I've met you several times in Sydney. We were there for the our bicentennial in 1989. She said, yes, I know. Very quickly interrupting me. And quick as a flash, she said, but you've got to be very careful about allowing migrants to change the character of your country. That she meant Asian migrants was very quickly confirmed by what she then used as a winning example. She said, think of Fiji. She said the Indians outnumber the native people. She said, you can't allow that migration to change the character of your country. And I thought, in one flash, I got an insight that no biographer is going to share. She is out of she's out of an imperial era mindset, where Britain did rule the waves and governed subject peoples. And I thought of her visit to Australia when I met her as opposition leader in New South Wales for that bicentennial in 1989, and how after meeting her, John Howard, coincidence or not, but I don't think it's a coincidence, John Howard made his very regrettable comments about too much Asian immigration changing the character of Australia too quickly, testing Australia too much Asian immigration, comments that I think he deeply regret. Was it just a coincidence that he made that commitment after, on that visit, he had his meeting with the then British Prime Minister, given which she later revealed to me about her deepest thoughts?
Thanks, Bob. I think Judy has some questions about your reading life.
Oh, hi, Bob. Thank you for taking our questions. I've enjoyed reading my reading life. My first point is really a comment, not a question. I think it's an excellent book, and it's so it's patchworked. It's got a structure in the division of the chapters, but it's not linear, and I think that's very representative, because our reading lives are not linear. They're cumulative, and they are patchwork. So I really like that aspect, and I really loved so many of the reading choices you talked about very eloquently in that work. And you've actually already answered part of what my question was going to be. I noticed Virginia Woolf was not in the index, but clearly you have read and taken a lot out of her work. But I noticed even in the section on the classic novelists, there's no Austen, there's no Brontes, there's no George Eliot. Did you, or you do talk at length about, and obviously I've greatly enjoyed Colleen McCulloch's work, particularly on the Roman era. Did you want to have a comment around some of those classic female authors?
Yes, that is, your observation is completely correct. I hadn't read those authors when I wrote this book. If I wrote it today, Middlemarch would have Private Place, George Eliot's Middlemarch. And I'm just about to embark on a reading of Jane Austen. I've downloaded an annotated version of Mansfield Park. I wanted to have an annotated version so I get a better sense of her positioning in literary history and in British history. The big issue of the society she was describing being dependent on the slave trade and the wealth derived from plantations. Virginia Woolf came to her, rediscovered her after I published this book. I would rate her and George Eliot very highly, and I'm looking forward to the challenge of Austen. So you're right to say there's a chaotic nature to my book. This is reading that grabbed me during the period I was very active in politics. And it was striking when I laid it down that there were so few women writers.
Thanks, Bob. That makes a lot of sense, and I wish you great joy of Mansfield Park and all the other Austen novels. And I'm so glad you mentioned Middlemarch, because Virginia Woolf famously said it's one of the few novels in English written for grown-ups, and I think I think that's absolutely the case. And it kind of brings me on my next point, really. And it's a kind of a big question, I guess. And it's not my insight. It was given to me by a learned and very elderly friend. And the idea is that if we read a work of Plato, say, or Middlemarch, or if we're dragged through King Lear in high school and we don't get it, but we come to the work again, say 10 or 20 years later, and suddenly we are struck by its greatness. We don't always get every aspect of it, because that's the thing about great works. You don't get all the aspects at once, or perhaps ever. But my friend's insight was, well, maybe even that first abortive reading, where you didn't seem to get it, maybe that has affected some transformation at some deep level that has made you more receptive for the second and subsequent readings. So I'd just like to ask what you think about that idea.
Yes, that is altogether possible. On the other hand, isn't it possible that your exposure, being frog-marched through something you see as an unappealing, unsympathetic word when you're very young, might cloud your judgment, that might prejudice you against it? I just think of the way we were taught Shakespeare at school. And I mean, it was an adventure. It was a challenge, because the language was so hard for someone in their second year at school. But the challenge of encountering something as an adult can be shocking. There can be a shock effect. Is it spoiled for us by the school time encounter? I just wonder about that. I admire those people who, in their teens, picked up War and Peace and devoured it. The daughter of friends of ours did that. She might have been 16. Maybe it was the personality of the young Rostov at the centre of so much action in the book that drew her as a teenage girl. But I came to these big challenging works late in life, and I found myself wishing for a book that would tell me, listen, War and Peace is not that hard. Think of two main characters, Pierre and Prince Andre. A lot of the action will revolve around them. Or think of it in terms of one large family and its relation to the big events driving Russian history, the Rostov family. And think of the contrast in a family that hasn't got their friendly instincts. And think of some luminous chapters, and I write about this in my book, like the marvelous chapter where the young Rostovs visit a relative deep in the Russian countryside, where there's an earthen floor and servants go barefooted, and Natasha, when she hears music play, dances a Russian peasant dance, as if she had been raised in that rural culture. Natasha's Dance. It's the title of a book about Russian culture. Natasha's Dance, because it says so much, and it's that one magic chapter in the book about the young Rostovs visiting a country relative and going hunting, and then that evening spent in that simple residence. If there'd been a book that said, don't be intimidated by the reputation of War and Peace or well-read Russian characters and Russian names you meet in its first pages, I would have embarked on it earlier. And that's why I wrote my reading life, to provide that service to people. You wouldn't have that terrific motivation, that teenage girl I spoke about, the daughter of friends of ours, but who, like me, would have appreciated a bit of assistance in lowering themselves into the great exploration, like entering a cave, a magic cave, of a work of literature like War and Peace.
Excellent.
So the Stoics talk about the importance of taking on a role model, and for them it was usually Socrates, perhaps Cato, figures they considered to be exemplars, and they called them sages. I'm wondering, Bob, as somebody who's been active in public life, whether you had particular historical role models or political role models, perhaps, that had that place for you in your psychic life, your ethical life, Whether you could say a few words about those.
I don't think it can be too explicit. I think you have figures flickering in corners of your consciousness. So for me, for my generation, Gough Whitlam was such a political leader, and his rhetorical patterns or his parliamentary style. I think as a youngster, I was impressed by the fact that Whitlam was something of a polymath, and I thought that was not only compatible with being in politics, but it was required to have read the books, to have trained oneself to be an orator, to give memorable parliamentary speeches, aspiring to real eloquence, and speeches on big public occasions outside Parliament, and not just what we might describe as adequate speeches or workman-like speeches. So Whitlam's there, and so too is the bold reformist instinct, and the Paul Keating and Neville Wran, who I watched as a young minister manage a cabinet. So they're influences. But when it comes to big historical figures, I'm not saying they shape my behaviour, but they flickered in my consciousness. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was President of the United States from 1933 to his death in 1945. Testing his full term, precedent, and Abraham Lincoln, for a number of reasons. They weren't plaster heroes. They were very flawed figures, and among the things that endears me to them is their capacity for making mistakes, and very big mistakes. And not that they're statespersons, but that they're politicians, practical politicians, elevated by the circumstances they were in, and their capacity to stamp a meaning, in FDR's case, on the Great Depression in America and the Second World War, and his own reform program. In Lincoln's case, of course, Civil War and the start of Reconstruction, the descent into war, the terrible war itself, in his inaugurals and his other great speeches and his commentary, his conversation, he stamped the meaning on the awful circumstances that had ripped America apart. So I'm drawn to them as historical figures, and as I say, not as models, but they play in your imagination as if they were people you knew, and indeed more vividly than people you had known.
Thanks for that fascinating answer. I really like the idea of flickering in the mind. It's the way that figures from literature and history can work, I think. Look, I've got one more question before we go to the people, which is a procedure you're well familiar with, Bob. I just want to ask you, now that you're in the senior years of your public life, are there things you wish you'd known earlier, perhaps before 95, for example, or just earlier, more widely?
I think it's hard to say. I couldn't say that about climate, because I remember beginning to read the literature on climate change, certainly in the early 90s. Bill McKibben's book, writer for the New York Times, he's written 2 books on climate now, but the first one, I think it was called The End of Nature, had a big impact on me for the vividness with which he described what was happening to the planet. He said, that's a great tribute to an author, if 30 years on you can recall anything from the book you read all that time ago. but he said, imagine you'd gone to the top of the world's highest mountain and you filled a test tube with the atmosphere. You did that 20 years ago, and you did it again today. He said the atmosphere you'd be taking down from the mountain, the test tube with you, would be different. It'd be chemically different. We've changed the composition, the chemical composition of the thin filigree of air that surrounds the planet. And he said this upper atmosphere is so small that it's a distance you could pedal in one afternoon. And that's where the heat trapping gases are being detained. So I'm proud of the fact that in 1995, my government responded on climate by protecting native vegetation very boldly, getting into a fight. We cancelled a power plant proposal because it would have been, I think, the first time in the world a power plant had been knocked back for development approval solely because of its contribution to greenhouse, and did a number of other things. It was the world's first carbon trading scheme. There are other things. I mean, I've had a progression. Back in those days, I was proudly president of Labour Friends of Israel. That's because I'd never heard a Palestinian story. I'd never been introduced to the displacement of Palestinians, or indeed met more than one or two Palestinians. But even though it was only out of a corner of my eye because I was focused on other things, I witnessed and took an interest in the spread of Israeli settlements on occupied Palestinian land designed to prevent a Palestinian state ever being created. So today, I can say, as a result of that, considering this evidence, I'm not patron of Labour Friends of Israel, I'm patron of Labour Friends of Palestine. Do I wish I'd known all these things back in 1977 when I invited Bob Carr to join me at the meeting in the trade school in Sydney and set up Labour Friends of Palestine, 1977? No, because the journey is part of life, being able to weigh evidence and see things from a different perspective over the span of years.
All right, thanks, Bob. That's it from me and I think from Judy. So, ladies and gentlemen, questions from the floor, hands, and Darren has the roving mic. Yep. 1, 2, 3, I can see.
Okay, Bob, just a quick question, I guess, following on from your comments about climate change. I suppose you're a politician, you were a foreign minister for a period, so I guess you got a sense of how international politics works as well. I guess as we come out of the pandemic, I wonder if we sort of draw the analogy of the pandemic as this moment of total failed global collective action, where we had trillions of dollars worth of economic activity to be wrought by distributing a global vaccine and sort of opening up economies and keeping them open for longer. And we sort of totally failed as a global community to be able to invest in distributing a global vaccine to all countries to make sure we had that economic gain. That seems like a total failure of our ability to act rationally as a species and act collectively to address a threat which I think in the pandemic was a much more real threat, physically, sort of existentially to us as humans, whereas climate change is a little bit more ephemeral as a threat as well and harder to understand in our real lives. Do you think there's, given that analogy, do you think there is much hope for climate action in the decades to come?
I think there is, because of ironically, the forces set in train by the market system, by the private sector. They're being told, look, CEOs and the investors, people in the boardrooms are being told the market is now pricing risk, and it's in your interest to get out of fossil fuels. Now, there are holdouts, and what do you mean by fossil fuels? You won't get banks investing in coal, but there's a reluctance to put gas in the same category. Nonetheless, the movement in the private sector is very real. I never thought that we would have someone making a credible takeover of an Australian energy company saying our first order of business will be to bring forward the closure of its coal-fired power plants and to accelerate our movement into renewables. Even when politicians take their eye off the transformation, this process in the corporate sector is moving decisively ahead. Mark Carney, the former head of the Bank of England, is presiding over what is now a commitment worth trillions in companies that are saying, no, we're out of the old stuff. The political leadership is counting as well. You couldn't get a president more committed to action on climate, a comprehensive agenda on climate as Biden. And the one good thing I can bring myself to say about Boris Johnson is that he set targets 2030, and when it comes to electric vehicles, 2035, that are pretty bold. Motivation doesn't matter. Action matters. And if you think of what COP26 said in funding South Africa to get out of the fossil fuels, and the fact that Indonesia is lining up to seek the same investment from COP27, which will take place in November in Cairo, all of a sudden, you're persuaded, even if you've got pessimistic instincts as I have, that we might just get there. 1.5, no more than 2 degrees warming. We've got to act knowing how grim things are, but as if we can manage this huge transition.
Maybe just because you're there, and then we'll go to you next.
Well, I just refer to your opening remarks regarding the US political beauty contest with George W. Bush and Al Gore. Do you think that that exists in Australia, given that my understanding anyway is that both sides of politics declare their positions vacant once the election's over? So that's the first part of my question. But the second part of my question is, does compulsory voting make any difference if we didn't have it in Australia with that beauty contest versus policy?
But I think the big difference doing away with compulsory voting would be this. It would be easier for interest groups, the gun lobby, for example, to think of a malign influence, to get their way when there's a lower voter turnout. So one reason the National Rifle Association has got so much influence in American politics is that in primary elections, especially if it's for a state governor or a state assembly person, the turnout is so low, it might be 15, it might be 20% of registered Republican voters. In that context, if you can get out all the gun owners through your mailing lists and your telephone calls or your social media, you've got enormous clout. That's one of the reasons that America can't face up to the power of the gun law. Compulsory voting means we are effectively requiring something like a 95% turnout out of polling booth. And we're forcing more people than otherwise to take an interest in the politics of their country and to make choices. And I think that's a very healthy thing compared with what prevails in the United States.
Got one more question from the floor, and then I think Judy, you say. Yeah, I think we do. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you could like go back to yourself, like your younger self, and force yourself to read one book where you're sort of giving yourself that summary or like that sense of like what direction the book is going, like you're talking about War and Peace. What book would it be and why?
Let's see. It wouldn't be Finnegan's Wake. And I remember what Martin Aiken said about it. He said he's angry with James because with all the effort he put into Finnegan's Wake, we might have had another 2 Ulysses. We might have had another half dozen Dubliners or Portrait of the Artist. It wouldn't be Finnegan's Wake because I can't see the return of the investment at the time I did. I'm trying to think of books that have cheated me, but there's none big looming presence. I mean, I'm very proud of getting through Don Quixote. Well, I don't think I've got Harold Bloom's passion for it, and it would be very hard to embark on it. I was proud of getting through Proust, but I really don't think I could do it again because there's so much bad writing among the brilliant writing. Sort of difficult swamps, little swamps. One thing I did discover in the last 6 months was a writer who defeated me in the past, and that's Thomas Mann. With the help of Audible, through the vehicle, Audible, I should say, I read with enormous pleasure Bevington Group, Family Saga, that he finished remarkably at the age of 25, and The Magic Mountain, which I would say is a book about death, a book about humans and death. But presented mysteriously, so there's plenty to debate in it. And a really difficult novel by him, Dr. Faustus, which I'll have to reread, but one that shows his genius, 1939, Lottie in Weimar, a book really that explores literary genius, in this case, the figure of Goethe. I felt the satisfaction in completing these works with real pleasure, that makes me think nothing is off limits, but at the right time in your life, you can open up an author who you really set aside in the past. And in that spirit, I'm overcoming a long-term resistance to Jane Austen, probably caused by exposure over 30 years to those movies about Jane Austen. That probably caused a revulsion. And I'm sure reading Mansfield Park will be a revelation.
Judy, do we have any online queries? No? Well, in that case, I want to, excuse me, we have one more, time for one more too. Bob, if you've got another 3 or 4 minutes.
Yes, I'll try and be as succinct as possible, but I'm very frustrated with the refugee situation in this country, and I'm wondering if you can paint a picture of a politician that may be courageous enough to approach it from a more humane perspective than what's happening today, particularly in that it's terrible, and secondly in the amount of money that is wasted in dealing with the situation.
Well, I think the political restraint is this. The government, no government will want to do something that reopens the human trafficking from ports in on the south coast of Java or in Sri Lanka, with people smugglers taking the risk with human cargoes transported into the Indian Ocean. Now, offshore processing and settlement has stopped that. It's brought it to a halt, and some techniques like boat turnbacks have done it. To me, assuring the Australian public that there will not be an incremental growth in people smuggling activity that they see as undermining our immigration program that enjoys majority support in this country, that's a good thing. But it is an invitation for Australia to be more generous. Why have we got Afghans who came here through that people smuggling route still locked up when they've committed no offence is an act of cruelty I can't believe. They can be released forthwith without any message going to people smugglers that their trade has got an opening again. Apart from anything else, the vote turnbacks guard against any recrudescence of people smuggling activity. So I can't believe our reluctance to give Afghans, especially we know what's now happening in Afghanistan and the Taliban rule, to give Afghans who got here over 10 years ago by unconventional means an access to permanent residency and citizenship. I mean, that really could have happened expeditiously, and it really would have been a good moment if a Conservative minister had done that. It would have signalled a lot. A minister and a Conservative government.
Well, Bob, we do need to finish at this time, but again, I just really want to thank you on behalf of the organisers and the event for your generosity and your time, and invite people to share their appreciation with mine. Thank you so much.